Midnight on the 14th of March, 2026. Two MH-60 Sierra helicopters, modified with low-observable skin and noise-reducing rotor tips, crossed the Iranian coastline at an altitude of less than 50 feet. They were not on a routine patrol of the Persian Gulf. They were the spearhead of a high-priority strike package carrying 24 operators from the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment, Delta, toward the Isfahan province. If the Russian-made early warning radars detected these ghost-like profiles against the jagged terrain, the mission would collapse into a diplomatic and military catastrophe before the first operative touched the ground. The night air was heavy with the scent of salt and the faint chemical tang of aviation fuel. Below the aircraft, the black void of the sea transitioned into the dark, rocky silhouettes of the Zagros Mountains. The vibration of the twin engines hummed through the deck plates of the lead helicopter, a constant, rhythmic pressure against the boots of the men waiting in silence. These were the elite of the United States military, and today, their objective was nothing less than the total destruction of the Natanz nuclear assembly annex, a facility the world believed was impenetrable. Inside the cramped cabin of the lead MH-60 Sierra helicopter, the cabin lights were set to a dim infrared glow that was invisible to the naked eye. The operators sat in 2 rows, their faces obscured by the matte black finish of their ballistic helmets and the 4-lens, panoramic night vision goggles flipped down over their eyes. Each man carried a suppressed .416 rifle, customized with laser aiming, modules, and thermal optics. They checked their gear with the mechanical precision of men who had done this 1,000 times before, ensuring that every magazine was seated and every grenade was secure. There was no chatter on the internal comms. The time for briefings had long since passed. The pilots, members of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, known as the Night Stalkers, stared through their own flight-grade night vision systems. They navigated using the ANAPQ 187 terrain-following radar, which allowed them to hug the contours of the mountain passes at speeds exceeding 140 knots. To any observer on the ground, the helicopters would have appeared as nothing more than a brief, flickering shadow accompanied by a low, muffled throb that was easily mistaken for the wind. At exactly 12:45 in the morning, the flight lead signaled the approach to the primary insertion point. The coordinates were locked at 32 degrees north, 51 degrees east. The terrain here was a desolate stretch of high-altitude plateau, 20 miles west of the primary target complex. The helicopters slowed, their noses pitching up as the pilots executed a flared landing in a natural bowl of rock and sand. The downwash from the rotors kicked up a thick cloud of dust that was immediately swallowed by the surrounding darkness. The heavy sliding doors of the helicopters retracted with a synchronized metallic click. The 24 operators moved as a single organism, flowing out of the cabins and into the cold mountain air. They did not run. They moved with a calculated, predatory gait, immediately fanning out into a security perimeter. Each squad leader checked his position against the encrypted satellite map projected onto his wrist-mounted display. The mission clock was now running. They had exactly 4 hours to reach the facility, bypass the exterior sensors, and set the charges before the sun rose over the Iranian desert. The cold air carried the sharp, biting smell of dry earth and ancient stone. The silence that followed the departure of the helicopters was absolute, broken only by the crunch of tactical boots on gravel and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the operators. Above them, the stars were brilliant and uncaring, providing the only light in a landscape that had become a battlefield. The team leader, a veteran sergeant major with 15 years in the unit, raised a single hand and signaled the advance. They began the 10-mile trek toward the Natanz annex, moving in a staggered column. The weight of their packs, filled with specialized C4 explosives and thermite charges, was a familiar burden. Every step was a calculated risk. The Iranian military maintained a series of listening posts along this ridge, manned by the Revolutionary Guard. To succeed, Delta would have to move like ghosts through a graveyard, avoiding every patrol and every thermal camera until they reached the steel skin of the assembly site. The stakes were absolute. Failure meant a nuclear-armed adversary. Success meant a world that could breathe again, if only for a little while. 1:15 in the morning on the 14th of March, 2026, 200 miles to the south of the insertion point, the flag bridge of the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln was a hive of controlled intensity. The air in the compartment was filtered and cool, smelling faintly of ozone and the heavy floor wax used on the deck plates. This was the nerve center for Operation Sapphire Silence, the place where the invisible threads of American military power were being pulled tight. The commanding officer of Carrier Strike Group 3 stood before a wall of liquid crystal displays, watching the digital ghost of the Delta Force team move slowly across a topographic map of the Isfahan province. The strategic posture of the United States in the region had shifted from containment to active neutralization exactly 72 hours earlier. Intelligence gathered by the Central Intelligence Agency and confirmed by Israeli Mossad had indicated that the Natanz annex was no longer just a research facility. It had become a final assembly point for a nuclear-tipped warhead, a development that crossed a red line established by the White House 3 years prior. The order from the National Security Council had been direct: terminate the program with extreme prejudice and ensure that no salvageable technology remained. To support the 24 operators on the ground, the United States Navy had deployed a massive electronic warfare screen. High above the Persian Gulf, 3 EA-18 Gulf Growlers from Electronic Attack Squadron 131 were currently bathing the Iranian northern radar corridor in a sophisticated blanket of digital noise. The ANALQ-99 jamming pods slung beneath their wings were emitting high-power signals that mimicked the background radiation of the atmosphere, effectively blinding the Iranian long-range early warning systems. To the operators of the Russian-made S-400 missile batteries near Tehran, the skies appeared perfectly clear, even as a lethal strike force moved through their backyard. On the flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln, a secondary response force was already at launch readiness. F-35 Bravo Lightning. 2 fighters sat on the catapults, their engines idling in a low, subsonic growl that vibrated through the steel hull of the 90,000-ton ship. These pilots were the insurance policy for the Delta teams. If the extraction went south, or if the Iranian Air Force scrambled their aging 4 Phantoms and modern Russian-made Su-35 fighters, the F-35 Bravos would be over the target area in less than 15 minutes. The smell of burning JP-5 fuel hung heavy over the flight deck, a sharp, chemical reminder of the kinetic power waiting to be unleashed. The mission was a masterclass in joint force integration. While the Navy provided the shield and the air cover, the Army's Joint Special Operations Command managed the ground elements through a high-bandwidth satellite link. The Tactical Operations Center at Fort Liberty, North Carolina, was receiving real-time biometric data from each operator. On the screens, 24 green icons blinked in synchronization with the heartbeats of the men moving through the Iranian mountains. Their pulses were steady, rarely rising above 60 beats per minute despite the freezing temperatures and the 300 pounds of equipment being carried by each 4-man cell. Tactically, the operation relied on a narrow window of opportunity. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard had scheduled a security rotation for 2 in the morning, a period of 15 minutes where the guard towers on the outer perimeter would be understaffed during the shift change. Delta had to be at the breach point precisely at 1:55. If they were 60 seconds late, they would be caught in the open by the fresh relief force. The plan was not just about fire and maneuver. It was about the surgical application of timing and technology. The geopolitical weight of the coming hours was not lost on the command staff. A failure here would not just be a tactical loss. It would likely ignite a regional war that could draw in every major power on the planet. But as the green icons on the map moved closer to the coordinates of the Natanz annex, there was no room for doubt. The United States had committed its most elite assets to a gamble of historic proportions. The silence in the command centers across the globe was a testament to the gravity of the moment. Every sensor, every satellite, and every sailor was focused on a single point in the Iranian desert, where 24 men were about to change the course of history. 1:55 in the morning on the 14th of March, 2026. The jagged black silhouette of the Natanz assembly annex loomed against the starlit sky like a fortress of industrial concrete and steel. Alpha and Bravo squads, 12 operators in total, had reached the final ridgeline, exactly 300 yards from the primary security fence. The air at this altitude was thin and freezing, carrying the dry scent of pulverized rock and the faint, oily smell of the massive diesel generators humming inside the compound. Each man remained perfectly still, their forms blending into the shadows of the boulders as they monitored the movement of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard sentries below. The outer perimeter of the facility was protected by a double-layered chain-link fence, topped with concertina wire and integrated with a network of seismic sensors and thermal cameras. To a conventional force, this would have been an impassable barrier, but the Delta operators were equipped with the latest in electronic countermeasure technology. 2 members of Alpha Squad crawled forward on their stomachs, their 6-man team providing overwatch with suppressed 416 rifles. They moved with agonizing slowness, ensuring that no sudden gesture would trigger the motion-sensitive algorithms of the security grid. The lead operator reached into a specialized pouch on his tactical vest and pulled out a handheld electronic bypass device. This unit, developed by the National Security Agency, was designed to inject a loop of static data into the facility's local area network. By tapping into a junction box located at coordinates 32 degrees 45 minutes north, 51 degrees 39 minutes east, the operator was able to freeze the thermal camera feeds for a segment of the fence 60 feet wide. The cold metal of the junction box felt like ice against his gloved fingers, but his hands remained steady as he spliced the fiber optic cable. As the digital loop took hold, a 2-man Iranian patrol emerged from the shadow of a concrete guard tower, walking a pair of Belgian Malinois guard dogs. The operators froze, pressing their bodies into the dirt. The dogs, trained to detect the scent of foreign chemicals and human sweat, paused and sniffed the air, their ears pricking up toward the ridge. The smell of gun oil and the salt from the operator's skin was a faint but distinct signal in the mountain air. One of the Iranian guards shouted a command in Farsi, pulling back on the leash as he swept a heavy-duty flashlight toward the rocks. The beam of white light cut through the darkness, passing just inches above the heads of the Delta team. On the ridge, the Bravo squad leader placed his finger on the trigger of his suppressed rifle, his optics centered on the guard's throat. He waited for the command that would break the silence. For 10 seconds, the only sound was the wind whistling through the concertina wire and the low, guttural growl of the dogs. Then, the guard laughed, exchanged a brief word with his partner about the mountain wind, and continued the patrol toward the southern gate. The tension in the air dissipated, leaving only the sharp, metallic taste of adrenaline in the mouths of the operators. With the patrol clear, the breach team used titanium wire cutters to create a silent opening in the first layer of the fence. They moved through the gap and repeated the process on the second layer, their movements synchronized and efficient. Once inside the perimeter, the 12 men transitioned from a crawl to a low, tactical crouch, moving toward the shadows of a large liquid nitrogen storage tank. The ground here was paved with gravel that crunched softly under their boots, a sound that felt like a thunderclap in the absolute stillness of the secure zone. The next obstacle was the primary entry point for the laboratory level's a massive, reinforced steel door controlled by a biometric scanner and a 6-digit rolling code. The operators did not intend to use the scanner. Instead, a combat engineer from Bravo Squad began to arrange a series of specialized linear-shaped charges around the door's hinge points. These charges were designed to use a focused jet of molten copper to cut through 4 inches of hardened steel in less than half a second. The smell of the plastic explosive was sweet and chemical, a stark contrast to the natural sense of the mountain night. High above, a silent MQ-9 Reaper drone circled at 25,000 feet, its multispectral targeting system providing a bird's-eye view of the entire complex. The drone pilot, operating from a ground station 3,000 miles away, confirmed that the secondary security rotation was currently moving toward the mess hall. Exactly as predicted. The window of opportunity was open. The team leader tapped his radio twice, a non-verbal signal that the perimeter was breached, and the team was moving to the point of entry. The mission was about to transition from a stealthy infiltration to a high-speed kinetic assault. 1:58 in the morning on the 14th of March, 2026, the primary blast door of the Natanz assembly annex, a 6-ton slab of reinforced steel and boron carbide composite, was the only thing standing between Alpha Squad and the laboratory levels. The air inside the small concrete alcove was stagnant, smelling of cold grease and the metallic tang of the ventilation system. The team leader of Alpha Squad raised 2 fingers, and the lead combat engineer pressed the adhesive backing of the 4 linear-shaped charges into the weld seams of the hinges. These were not standard demolition blocks. They were precision instruments designed to focus a jet of molten copper at a speed of 8,000 meters per second, cutting through 4 inches of hardened steel as if it were parchment. The silence of the mountain night was suddenly replaced by a sharp, localized hiss, the sound of the specialized thermite igniting. There was no massive roar, only a blinding white line of sparks that traced the rectangular outline of the door. The heat was instantaneous and intense, radiating outward and warming the ceramic plates in the operators' tactical vests. The smell of burning metal and ozone filled the alcove, a thick, chemical cloud that was quickly sucked into the facility's pressurized air intake. 3 seconds later, the hinges were severed. The 6-ton door groaned once, a deep, structural sound of metal screaming against metal, before it fell forward. 2 operators caught the weight of the door with hydraulic rams, lowering it silently onto a rubberized mat to prevent the sound of the impact from echoing through the subterranean corridors. As the door settled, the pressurized air from inside the lab rushed out a blast of sterile, recycled oxygen that smelled of industrial floor wax and high-voltage electronics. Alpha Squad moved immediately, their 416 rifles shouldered, and their infrared lasers cutting through the swirling dust of the breach. They were no longer in the natural world. They had entered a labyrinth of white tile and fluorescent lights where every corner was a potential kill zone. The interior of the laboratory level was a long, clinical corridor that stretched for 60 meters before reaching the first security checkpoint. The lighting was harsh and flickering, casting long, distorted shadows against the sterile walls. Delta moved in a staggered file, their boots making no sound on the polished linoleum. At the end of the hall, 2 Iranian Revolutionary Guard sentries, startled by the sudden change in air pressure, stepped out from behind a glass-reinforced security station. They were armed with AK-47 rifles, but they were not wearing night vision. To them, the corridor was a blur of shadows and the lingering haze of the breach. The team leader of Alpha Squad did not hesitate. He squeezed the trigger of his suppressed rifle twice. The sound was nothing more than a mechanical click, and the soft hiss of the bolt cycling. 2 supersonic rounds of 5.56mm ammunition punched through the glass of the security station and struck the first sentry in the upper chest, throwing him backward against the wall. The second sentry reached for his radio, his eyes wide with a terror that hadn't yet found a voice. Before he could depress the transmit button, 3 more rounds from the flank operator severed the nerves in his neck, dropping him instantly to the floor. The entire engagement lasted less than 2 seconds. There was no alarm, no shouting, only the sound of 2 bodies sliding against the tile and the rhythmic hum of the facility's cooling fans. Alpha Squad reached the security station and began the process of hard-pointing the hallway. 1 operator took a position behind the reinforced glass, monitoring the internal closed-circuit television monitors that showed the heart of the assembly hall. The lab was populated by technicians in white hazmat suits, moving with oblivious precision around a metallic cylinder that was suspended in a magnetic cradle. This was the warhead, the primary objective of Operation Sapphire Silence. The air in the security station was thick with the iron smell of fresh blood and the faint, sweet scent of the tea the guards had been drinking only seconds before. Bravo Squad moved up behind Alpha, leapfrogging into the secondary corridor that led to the reactor cooling controls. Their mission was to sabotage the backup power systems, ensuring that once the primary charges were set, the facility's automated fire suppression systems would remain offline. The transition from the cold, open mountains to this claustrophobic, high-tech environment had sharpened the operator's senses. Every hum of a server, every click of a relay, and every distant footstep was a target to be neutralized. The team leader checked his wrist-mounted display. They were exactly 4 minutes ahead of schedule. The interior of the Natanz annex was a fortress, but it was a fortress built to keep people out, not to fight an enemy that was already inside the wire. As they moved deeper into the mountain, the temperature began to rise, the air growing heavy with the radiant heat of the centrifuges spinning in the lower levels. The core of the facility was now only 200 meters away. The operators adjusted their grips on their weapons, their eyes scanning the interlocking fields of fire. The real work was about to begin. 2:02 in the morning on the 14th of March, 2026. Alpha Squad reached the final reinforced pressure seal leading into the central assembly hall of the Natanz nuclear annex. Through the thick lead glass observation port, the operators saw the primary objective, a metallic, cone-shaped cylinder suspended by high-tension cables in the center of a sterile, white-tiled room. This was the warhead assembly, a device that represented 10 years of clandestine Iranian research and billions of dollars in redirected national wealth. 10 Iranian technicians in white biological hazard suits were moving around the base of the device, monitored by 6 elite members of the Revolutionary Guard's Special Security Detachment. The air in the staging area was cold and smelled of filtered oxygen and the faint, ozone-like scent of the high-voltage magnetic stabilizers. The team leader of Alpha Squad checked his weapon one last time, ensuring the infrared laser was slave to his night vision optics. He signaled the point man, who held a specialized flashbang grenade, a device designed to emit 7 million candela of light and 170 decibels of sound. With a sharp, synchronized motion, the point man kicked the door release, and the heavy pressure seal slid open with a pneumatic hiss. The point man threw the grenade into the center of the hall. A fraction of a second later, a white-hot orb of light bleached the room, followed by a physical shockwave that rattled the glass observation panels. The technicians were thrown to the floor, clutching their eyes and ears in a state of total sensory collapse. The 6 Revolutionary Guard sentries, though better trained, were momentarily paralyzed by the sheer intensity of the overpressure. The trigger was squeezed. The lead operator's suppressed .416 rifle barked in short, controlled bursts that sounded like heavy hailstones hitting a metal roof. The supersonic rounds punched straight through the chest plates of the 2 nearest guards, the kinetic energy spinning their bodies around before they hit the floor. The ceramic tiles behind them erupted in a spray of white dust and red mist as the bullets exited. The air was instantly filled with the sharp, acrid smell of burnt powder and the copper tang of fresh blood. One of the remaining Iranian guards dived behind a heavy steel workbench, blindly raking the doorway with his AK-47 rifle. The heavy 7.62mm rounds hammered into the door frame, sending shards of concrete and hot metal fragments flying across the corridor. The Delta operators did not flinch. They pivoted as a single unit, their interlocking fields of fire converging on the workbench. A concentrated volley of 60 rounds shredded the steel tabletop and the man behind it, the heavy metal slamming into the floor with a rhythmic, metallic clatter. The guard was silenced instantly, his weapon sliding across the floor in a pool of hydraulic fluid and oil. The hall fell into a heavy, ringing silence, broken only by the low, electronic whine of the damaged magnetic stabilizers and the rhythmic gasping of the blinded technicians. Black smoke from the short-circuited control consoles curled toward the ceiling, obscuring the bright fluorescent lights. The floor was a chaotic landscape of broken glass, spent brass casings, and the motionless forms of the security detail. Alpha Squad moved through the room with clinical efficiency, zip-tying the surviving technicians and establishing a 360-degree security perimeter around the nuclear device. The team leader stepped up to the warhead. The device was warm to the touch, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that he could feel through his tactical gloves. He looked at his watch. It was 2:06 in the morning. They were inside the heart of the Iranian nuclear program, and the target was secured. He tapped his radio twice to signal Bravo Squad, who were now moving to set the secondary thermite charges on the facility's cooling pumps. The transition from the violent explosion of the breach to the eerie stillness of the assembly hall was jarring. The operators worked in total silence, their movements practiced and certain. Every man knew that while the room was secure, the entire facility would soon be swarming with reinforcements from the main Natanz garrison. They had exactly 8 minutes to wire the warhead and the primary structural supports with 20 pounds of C4 explosive. If they succeeded, the mountain would become a tomb for the Iranian nuclear dream. If they failed, they would be trapped 300 feet underground with no way out. 2:10 in the morning on the 14th of March, 2026. The central assembly hall of the Natanz annex was no longer a laboratory. It had become a high-stakes demolition site. Alpha Squad's lead technician, a staff sergeant with 3 combat tours in specialized munitions, worked with surgical precision at the base of the nuclear warhead. He was not using standard blocks of C4. Instead, he was installing a series of 6 sapphire-shaped charges, proprietary United States Navy explosives, designed to focus a plasma jet of 5,000 degrees Celsius directly into the plutonium pit of the weapon. The goal was not a nuclear detonation, but a total chemical and thermal liquefaction of the radioactive material, rendering the core a useless, slagged mass of heavy metal. The air in the hall was thick with the smell of scorched electronics and the chemical odor of the adhesive strips used to secure the detonators. Outside the main observation deck, the low, rhythmic thumping of heavy boots echoed through the ventilation shafts. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard garrison, alerted by the silence of the internal security detail, was moving in force. A specialized Quds Force tactical unit, numbering 40 men, was currently descending the primary elevator shaft less than 100 meters from the hall's eastern bulkhead. The team leader of Alpha Squad looked at his tactical map. The red icons representing the enemy were converging on their position from 3 different directions. He signaled to the squad's heavy weapons specialist, who carried an M32 Oni multi-shot grenade launcher slaved to a thermal optic. "Hold the eastern bulkhead," the team leader ordered, over the encrypted short-range radio. "Nothing comes through that door until the timer is slaved." The specialist nodded, bracing his weapon against a heavy lead-shielded workbench and centering his crosshairs on the massive double-leaf security doors that served as the primary entrance for heavy equipment. The trigger was squeezed. The M32 Aeon roared, a deep, mechanical thump that vibrated through the concrete floor of the hall. The 40mm high-explosive dual-purpose grenade shrieked across the 60-meter gap, trailing a faint wisp of gray smoke. It struck the center of the heavy eastern security door just as the magnetic locks were disengaged from the other side. The warhead punched straight through the 2-inch-thick steel plate, detonating inside the cramped vestibule on the other side. The impact was catastrophic. The blast wave shattered the heavy hinges, sending the 3-ton steel doors flying outward into the hallway like pieces of scrap metal. A white-hot fireball erupted from the breach, fueled by the ignition of several hydraulic fluid lines that had been severed by the shrapnel. The sound was a deafening, sharp crack that compressed the eardrums of everyone in the room, followed immediately by the scream of metal tearing away from the frame. The Iranian Special Security Team on the other side of the door was caught in the center of the kill zone. The lead element of 6 men was thrown backward. By the overpressure, their bodies slammed against the concrete walls with enough force to crush ballistic plates. The survivors scrambled to find cover in the smoke-filled corridor. their voices rising in a panicked cacophony of Farsi commands and screams. They attempted to return fire, raking the opening with 3 AK-47 rifles, but the fire was wild and undisciplined. The heavy slugs hammered into the thick lead glass of the observation deck, spiderwebbing the surface but failing to penetrate the reinforced layers. The immediate aftermath was a landscape of gray dust and orange flame. The thick, black smoke from the burning hydraulic oil billowed into the assembly hall, reducing visibility to less than 5 meters. The sound of the facility's emergency sirens finally began to wail a high-pitched, rhythmic scream that signaled the total breach of the inner sanctum. Through the haze, the Delta operators could see the distorted silhouettes of the Iranian soldiers through their thermal optics. But the enemy was pinned down, trapped behind a wall of fire and twisted steel. The momentum of the counterattack had been broken in a single, violent 3-second window. Inside the hall, the demolition specialist didn't look up from his work. He finished the final connections on the 6 Sapphire charges and pulled a ruggedized tablet from his thigh pocket. He synchronized the encrypted firing sequence with the mission clock. "Charges are set and slaved to the master remote," he announced, his voice calm despite the gunfire echoing from the hallway. 10-minute countdown on my mark. The team leader checked his biometric display. The heart rates of his men remained in the 80s, a testament to their absolute focus under fire. "Mark," he replied. "Bravo, squad. We're moving to the extraction point at the secondary ventilation shaft. Alpha is breaking contact now." The Delta operators began a leapfrog withdrawal, using smoke grenades to mask their movement as they moved toward the rear of the hall. They left behind the technicians, still bound and blinded, and a nuclear warhead that was now a ticking clock for this end of the facility. The heat from the burning hydraulic oil was rising, and the smell of ozone was being replaced by the heavy, suffocating scent of a building starting to die. 2:15 in the morning on the 14th of March, 2026. The secondary ventilation shaft of the Natanz annex was less than 80 meters away, but Alpha and Bravo squads were fighting for every meter of the narrow service corridor. The plan for a silent withdrawal had vanished the moment the eastern bulkhead was breached, and now the 24 Delta operators were engaged in a running gunfight against a superior numerical force of Iranian Revolutionary Guard reinforcements. The air in the corridor was a choking soup of gray concrete dust, acrid cordite, and the metallic smell of blood. Red emergency lights pulsed in synchronization with the shrieking sirens, casting long, rhythmic shadows that danced across the bullet-scarred walls. The Delta teams moved in a classic rolling T formation, with the point men providing suppressive fire, while the rear elements leaped frog toward the next point of cover. The sound of the engagement was a deafening, overlapping roar of suppressed 5.56 millimeter fire and the sharp, unsuppressed cracks of Iranian AK-47 rifles. Each time an operator fired, the muzzle flash illuminated the haze for a microsecond, revealing the carnage of the close-quarters struggle. The floor was littered with spent brass casings and shattered pieces of fluorescent light fixtures that crunched under the heavy tread of tactical boots. Bravo, 2, status on the shaft. The team leader shouted over the bone conduction headset. His voice was steady, filtered through the heavy breathing of a man under extreme physical and mental stress. "Shaft is clear, but the hoist is dead," came the reply from the Bravo squad leader. "We are rigging the fast ropes for a vertical climb. We need 3 minutes of hard cover at the junction." The junction was a 4-way intersection located at coordinates 32 degrees 45 minutes, 12 seconds north, 51 degrees 39 minutes 8 seconds east. It was the last major choke point before the ventilation vertical. The team leaders signaled for the squad's SAW gunner to take a kneeling position behind a heavy industrial transformer. The operator, carrying an M249 light machine gun, bipod mounted the weapon and began to rake the hallway with controlled 5-round bursts. The heavy lead slugs hammered into the far wall, shredding the drywall and sending chunks of plaster flying into the faces of the advancing Iranian soldiers. A group of 5 Quds Force operators attempted to flank the Delta position through a parallel maintenance crawlspace. They emerged from a side hatch, less than 10 meters from Alpha Squad's rearguard. The lead Iranian soldier lunged forward, his bayonet fixed, his eyes wide with desperate fervor. The Delta rearguard operator didn't have time to bring his rifle to bear. He transitioned to his sidearm, a David mm Glock 19, and fired 3 rounds into the center mass of the attacker. The impact of the bullets sent the man sprawling back into his comrades, the kinetic force collapsing the group into a tangled mess of limbs and equipment. The smell of hot lead and sweat was overpowering in the confined space. Despite the intensity of the fight, the operators maintained strict ammunition discipline. Every 3 bursts, the operators would tap their magazines, checking the weight to ensure they weren't running dry. "Green on ammo. Shifting left," one operator yelled, his voice barely audible over the clatter of the machine gun. They were operating on the ragged edge of their endurance, their uniforms soaked in sweat, and the cooling fans in their night vision goggles whirring at maximum speed to prevent fogging in the humid, smoke-filled air. As Bravo Squad secured the fast ropes in the ventilation shaft, the team leader looked at his mission clock. 6 minutes remained until the primary charges on the nuclear warhead detonated. The thermal radiation from the burning laboratory levels was starting to migrate up the shaft, creating a shimmering heat haze that distorted their vision. The mountain itself seemed to be groaning, the structural integrity of the lower levels beginning to fail as the secondary thermite charges melted through the main support pillars. "Ropes are set. Go, go, go," the Bravo leader signaled. The operators began their ascent, gripping the thick nylon ropes and using their leg strength to drive themselves upward toward the surface, 300 feet above. The machine gunner was the last to move, throwing a final pair of M84 flashbang grenades down the hallway to mask his withdrawal. The twin detonations bleached the corridor white, followed by a momentary silence as the Iranian forces were plunged into a state of total sensory blindness. By the time the smoke cleared, the Delta operators were already halfway up the shaft, moving toward the cold night air of the Iranian plateau. The extraction was no longer a hope. It was a desperate race against a countdown that was about to end in a pillar of fire. 2:20 in the morning on the 14th of March, 2026. The 24 operators of the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta emerged from the mouth of the ventilation shaft at coordinates 32 degrees 45 minutes north, 51 degrees 39 minutes east. The cold mountain air was a sharp, revitalizing shock to their lungs, washing away the acrid taste of cordite and burnt hydraulic fluid. They moved in a low, tactical sprint toward the extraction point, where the 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters were already descending into a hover, their rotor wash kicking up a blinding swirl of snow and sand. The mission clock on the team leader's wrist-mounted display ticked down the final 60 seconds. Deep beneath the surface, the heart of the Natanz nuclear annex was about to be erased. The master remote, synchronized with the military satellite overhead, sent the final encrypted firing signal. Inside the assembly hall, the 6 sapphire-shaped charges fired in a perfect, microsecond sequence. The white-hot jets of plasma, reaching temperatures of 5,000 degrees Celsius, punched straight into the plutonium pit of the nuclear warhead. There was no atomic explosion. Instead, the core was instantly liquefied, transformed into a useless, molten slag of heavy metal that burned through the floor plates and deep into the concrete foundation. The primary C4 charges, positioned on the structural supports, and the primary cooling reservoirs detonated 3 seconds later. The result was a massive, subterranean shockwave that rippled through the limestone mountain. The 300-foot-deep facility underwent a catastrophic structural failure. The support pillars, weakened by the thermite charges set by Bravo Squad, were shredded by the force of the high explosives. The ceiling of the laboratory levels, weighing tens of thousands of tons, collapsed downward in a single, crushing movement. The ground beneath the extraction point heaved upward, then settled with a deep, resonant boom that felt like a low-frequency punch to the chests of the operators. A massive column of black smoke and pulverized concrete erupted from the ventilation shaft, shooting 200 feet into the night sky like the breath of a dying volcano. The heat from the fires below turned the mouth of the shaft into a glowing orange throat. The shockwave sent a wall of dust and debris rolling across the plateau, coating the black helicopters in a layer of gray ash. Beat 2 of the destruction was even more decisive. The secondary detonation of the facility's underground fuel reserves and high-pressure liquid nitrogen tanks created a secondary overpressure that blew the primary blast doors off their hinges from the inside out. The mountain itself seemed to moan. As the internal voids were filled by falling rock and twisted steel, the entire Natanz annex, the centrifuges, the laboratories, and the assembly line, was crushed out of existence. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard reinforcements, still inside the lower corridors, were vaporized or entombed under millions of tons of rubble in an instant. The Delta operators scrambled into the open cabins of the helicopters. The crew chiefs pulled them inside, checking each man against the manifest. The smell of scorched earth and the chemical bite of the demolition charges hung heavy in the air. As the MH-60 Sierra helicopters pitched their noses down and accelerated toward the coastline, the operators looked back at the site. Where the fortress had once stood, there was now only a jagged, smoking sinkhole in the side of the ridge. The orange glow of the fires reflected off the low-hanging clouds, a silent marker of a program that had been terminated. The immediate aftermath was a deafening silence that settled over the plateau, broken only by the fading throb of the helicopter rotors. The thermal signatures of the facility on the United States military satellite feeds shifted from brilliant white to a dull, cooling gray. The electronic warfare screen provided by the EA-18 Gulf Growlers remained active, ensuring that the extraction force vanished into the Iranian night before the first search and rescue teams could even reach the smoking crater. The mission objective had been achieved with surgical brutality. The assembly site was destroyed, the core material was neutralized, and the facility was a total loss. As the helicopters crossed back over the dark waters of the Persian Gulf, the team leader tapped his radio one final time to the command center on the USS Abraham Lincoln. Package delivered. Site is dark. All operators accounted for. The message was simple, but the weight of it would be felt for decades. The United States had not just destroyed a building, it had dismantled a future. 6:30 in the morning on the 14th of March, 2026. The flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln. The two MH-60 Sierra helicopters touched down on the non-skid surface with a heavy, mechanical jar. Just as the first pale light of dawn began to break over the North Arabian Sea, the 24 operators of Delta Force stepped out of the cabins, their faces smeared with gray ash and the salt of the Iranian plateau. The air on the flight deck was cold and bracing, smelling of the ocean and the sharp, high-octane scent of JP-5 jet fuel. The mission was over, but the strategic shockwaves were only beginning to radiate outward from the ruins of the Isfahan province. Inside the carrier's tactical flag command center, the mood was one of somber, professional relief. The final post-strike intelligence report, compiled from multispectral imagery provided by the MQ-9 Reaper drone and the KH-11 Keyhole satellite, was displayed on the main screen. The coordinates at 32 degrees north, 51 degrees east showed a massive tectonic depression where the Natanz annex had once stood. There was no sign of secondary radioactive leakage, confirming that the sapphire-shaped charges had successfully liquefied the plutonium core without a fissile detonation. The Iranian nuclear assembly capability had been effectively neutralized, set back by an estimated 10 to 15 years. The casualty assessment was clinical and precise. On the Iranian side, the United States estimated that 242 personnel, including elite Revolutionary Guard security forces and senior nuclear technicians, were killed in the initial breach or the subsequent structural collapse of the facility. The Natanz garrison had been caught in a state of total tactical surprise, their defensive layers bypassed by a combination of electronic warfare and surgical precision. On the American side, the cost was remarkably light but not absent. 2 Delta operators had sustained non-life-threatening shrapnel wounds during the fighting retreat in the service corridor, and 1 Night Stalker helicopter had suffered minor damage. From small arms fire, all 24 operators and 6 aircrew members were safely back aboard the strike group. The geopolitical resolution of Operation Sapphire Silence began within the hour, while the Iranian government issued a series of frantic, contradictory statements regarding an industrial accident at a mountain research site. The United States Department of Defense released a single, brief statement confirming a successful counter-proliferation operation designed to protect regional stability. There was no triumphalism in the report, only a cold statement of fact. The professional integration of Carrier Strike Group 3, the Night Stalkers of the 160th, and the operators of Delta Force had executed a mission that many in the Pentagon had deemed impossible. By 8 in the morning, the 24 operators had been moved to the lower decks for debriefing and medical evaluation. They stripped off their sweat-soaked tactical vests and cleaned the grit from their rifles, their movements slow and methodical as the adrenaline finally left their systems. The smell of the facility, the ozone, the burnt powder, and the copper tang of the laboratory was replaced by the familiar, mundane sense of the carrier's mess hall, scorched coffee and industrial soap. The men did not celebrate, they ate. In silence, their eyes hollow with the exhaustion of 4 hours spent in the heart of enemy territory. The long-term impact of the strike would be analyzed by historians for decades. By choosing a surgical ground assault over a massive aerial bombardment, the United States had avoided a full-scale regional war while simultaneously demonstrating a terrifying level of reach and lethality. The message sent to other adversaries was clear. No mountain was deep enough, and no steel door was thick enough to provide sanctuary once the decision to strike had been made. The Sapphire technology had proven that even the most dangerous weapons could be unmade by the right men with the right tools. As the USS Abraham Lincoln turned back toward the open waters of the Indian Ocean, the sun rose fully over the horizon, bleaching the sky a brilliant, uncaring blue. The flight deck crews began the routine process of spotting the F-35 Bravo fighters, preparing for the next cycle of patrols. The war that didn't happen was the greatest victory of the day. The silence of the North Arabian Sea was the only tribute the operators required. Operation Sapphire Silence was closed.